Have you ever wondered, like, what really drives your choices? Are we totally in control, or are there, like, unseen forces kind of pulling the strings?
Ooh, getting deep right off the bat.
Well, that's what we're diving into today. This podcast episode we're looking at asks, who leads your life? Spirit of God or the evil one?
Whoa, that's a pretty intense title.
It is, right. And we're going to, break it down, see what we can learn about the stuff that might be influencing us, even if we don't realize it.
Definitely a single source deep dive today, just this one podcast, but it's packed with, well, let's just say food for thought.
Yeah, when I first saw that title, I have to admit I was a little intimidated. What about you, listener? Does that make you feel empowered or kind of nervous?
It definitely grabs your attention, and the podcast doesn't waste any time. It jumps right in and says this conversation is going to challenge you, make you think, and help you take charge of your spiritual life.
Okay, that sounds pretty intense.
It is, but here's the twist. This podcast says that no spirit, good or evil, can actually work on Earth without us humans giving them permission.
So we're not just puppets.
Exactly. We have a choice. We're the ones who decide. And that brings us to their first principle: what fills you leads you.
Okay, what does that actually mean? Like, how does that work in real life?
So think of it this way. Everything we do, everything we think, even the things we watch or listen to, they all create a certain energy.
A spiritual vibe.
Yeah, something like that. And that vibe, that energy, it can either attract or repel certain forces.
So if you're always thinking negative thoughts or doing things that are harmful, you're basically inviting something not so good into your life.
That's the idea. The podcast uses the example of Jesus being filled with the Holy Spirit and then immediately being led into the wilderness to be tempted. It's in Luke chapter 4, verse 1.
Oh, right. Even Jesus, who, is supposed to be perfect, had to deal with temptation.
Exactly. And it shows how being filled with a certain spirit, whether it's good or bad, can directly affect the situations we find ourselves in.
So it's not just about avoiding bad stuff, but about actively trying to create a good atmosphere inside yourself.
Exactly. And this podcast goes even further. They say that every work of the flesh, meaning anything you do that goes against your best self, actually invites something negative to take control.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Do they mean that literally? Like an evil spirit jumps in and takes over?
That's a great question. What do you think, listener? Is it literal or more of a metaphor?
To explain this point, they tell the story of the Gadarene demoniac. It's in Mark chapter 5. That guy who was possessed by demons and then they were transferred into a bunch of pigs.
Yeah, wild story, right? But pigs, in Jewish tradition, were considered unclean.
Oh, interesting. So are they saying that if we have unclean habits or thoughts, it's like we're making ourselves easy targets for negative stuff?
It's one way to look at it. It's like we're inviting those forces in, even if we don't realize it.
Makes you think about what those pigs represent in our own lives, huh? What are we giving power to without even knowing it?
That's a powerful question. And it leads to the next principle. You are a slave to what overcomes you.
Okay, that sounds a little scary. What do they mean by that?
Well, it's not meant to scare you. It's more about, like, recognizing the patterns in our lives. Have you ever felt trapped by a bad habit? You just can't seem to break free, you know?
Oh, totally. That feeling of being stuck, like a negative thought pattern or behavior you just can't shake. You can feel like you're a slave to it.
Exactly. And they actually quote a verse from the Bible to back this up. It's from 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 19. It says, we basically become slaves to whatever we're constantly obeying, whether it's something good or bad.
So it's not just about outside forces, but also these internal struggles we all deal with.
Right. It's about recognizing what we're giving power to. What are we putting our energy into, Because whatever we focus on, that's what grows.
So they're saying it's like being enslaved to these negative forces, but there's also freedom that comes with choosing something, something better, something positive.
Right. And they use Jesus as an example. Because he was free from sin, he could resist temptation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there's this verse in John 14:30 where Jesus says the devil has nothing in him. So the podcast suggests that because Jesus was like pure and completely aligned with his purpose, those negative forces couldn't touch him.
So it's like temptation just bounced right off him. He didn't even notice.
That's the idea, yeah. But then it makes you wonder, like, what does that mean for us regular folks, right?
Right.
We're not perfect. We mess up. We struggle.
Right. So are we just destined to constantly fight these negative influences? Is there, like, no way to escape?
Well, that leads us to what I think is the core of it all, this idea of a battle for control. It's the third principle they talk about.
It's a pretty powerful image, isn't it? Like this tug of war going on inside us all the time.
They describe the soul as the battleground, where all the decisions are made and where our deepest desires live. It's like the control center for our entire being, basically.
And the way they explain it, the devil is always lurking around trying to tempt us with those, quick fixes and instant gratification, shiny distractions. It's like he wants to trade those things for a piece of our soul.
Ooh, that's a great way to put it. A cosmic deal with the devil. It makes you think about those times you felt tempted. Like, what was really going on in those moments? Was it just about that thing you were craving, or was it something deeper, a need for control or escape, maybe?
Yeah, I know for me, those temptations are often less about the thing itself and more about what it represents. Like maybe I want that sugary treat, not because I'm actually hungry, but because I'm stressed and want a quick mood boost.
Exactly. It's about those deeper feelings that we're trying to deal with. And the podcast argues that giving in to those quick fixes, those temptations that promise instant gratification, it ultimately leaves you feeling empty and disconnected.
Right. But if you choose to connect with something bigger, something more meaningful, that's where the real happiness comes from.
That's what they're saying, yeah. They believe true happiness is about aligning yourself with, your purpose, with good, with love.
But is it really that black and white? Like, is it always one or the other? You give in and you're doomed, you resist and you're good.
That's a good point. And to be fair, this podcast is coming from a specific religious viewpoint. There are definitely other traditions that might see it differently.
Right. Always good to remember there are different perspectives out there.
Totally. And it's up to each of us to decide what feels right. But even if we don't agree with all the religious stuff, there's still some good food for thought in here.
Oh, definitely. Like, I don't necessarily believe in a literal devil,
Yeah.
but I can totally relate to feeling tempted, struggling with those less than ideal impulses, feeling like you're fighting for control over your own mind.
Exactly. And I think this podcast offers some interesting ideas about those struggles and maybe some ways to find a little more peace with ourselves.
Okay, so we've talked about these three principles. What fills you, leads you, being a slave to what overcomes you, and this whole battle for control thing. But there's one more piece of this whole who's really in control puzzle that really got me thinking.
Oh, yeah. You mean how this podcast says no spirit, good or evil, can actually do anything here unless we humans cooperate?
Yeah, exactly. It's like we don't just get influenced by these forces. We actually give them permission to mess with us. It's a kind of crazy thought when you really think about it.
It is, right. The podcast really emphasizes how God gave humans this huge responsibility, to take care of the earth and make choices. But it also implies that we can screw that up, that we can accidentally give power to stuff we don't even understand.
So, like, if we make choices that go against, being our best selves, like being loving and compassionate, it's like we're giving away a piece of ourselves to something else.
Yeah, I think that's the idea. And it goes back to that first principle, remember, what fills you leads you. If we're always focused on negativity, fear, anger, all that stuff, we're creating this, energy that attracts more of the same.
It's almost like we're walking magnets for whatever we're putting out there. That's kind of a scary thought. I mean, we have a much bigger impact on the world, maybe even our own lives, than we realize.
Right. I think that's exactly what the podcast is trying to tell us. It's like a wake-up call.
Yeah.
We're not just watching this whole cosmic show. We're part of it. Our choices really matter, both for ourselves and everyone else.
But, I mean, that also means we have the power to change things for the better, right? If we choose to focus on love, kindness, being generous, we're not just making our own lives better, we're making a difference in the world, too.
Absolutely. It's a pretty cool concept when you think about it.
Right.
Even small things can make a difference. A smile, helping someone out, a kind word. It might not seem like much, but it can change someone's day, and maybe even shift the energy of the whole world just a little bit.
So even if we don't believe in all the religious stuff this podcast is talking about, I think there's a message here we can all relate to. We have more power than we think to change our lives and the world around us. And it starts with paying attention to what we're doing, what we're thinking, and choosing to focus on the good stuff.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So, listener, we'll leave you with this. What are you filling yourself with? What are you putting your energy into? The choice is always yours.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.